Hello and welcome to the Art of Poetry. My name is James Morehead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California. I'm the author of Canvas. I host a weekly podcast, the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and I'm writer-producer of a animated short film, Tethered, based on a poem of the same name. In this presentation, I'm going to use my poetry to share some of the techniques that I have found helpful in writing and reciting poetry. I get asked a lot, well, how do you start a poem? The key thing is to just write, whether that's writing on your phone or a back of an envelope or in a notebook. Just write. Don't worry about the form of the poem. Don't worry about what it means or how it ends or how it begins. Just start writing down words, ideas, and images. And the form of the poem and what you're trying to say will emerge. Sometimes you know that right up front and you have a really strong idea and you just have to figure out how to craft it. Much of the time for me, I just have an image that catches my eye or affects me, and I just start writing about it and then figure out what the poem is. So the form emerges. It's critical that you seek out feedback that is from ideally other poets and other writers. Just sort of banal feedback like I like it or that's fine isn't terribly useful. You need people to point out things they really like and things they don't really like. And that's workshopping. So if you can find a critique group, you have a huge advantage as a writer. And because of COVID, a lot of these things have gone online, and it's an opportunity to reach out to poets that aren't necessarily in your same area. And as a result of that feedback, you're going to revise your poem, rewrite it, and edit it over and over again. So to demonstrate that idea, I'm going to start by reading a poem that was recently turned into a piece of music by Dion Nielsen Price. The poem went through many revisions, as I'll show in a minute, but I'll read the final form. Dissolving in the Gallery. Welcome to our gallery, I read in dulling bronze. Our artisans suggest you linger in each hall, for if you pause and stare for hours, you may be reborn. I first stop in the library, lined with ancient tomes, and watch the words slip from their pages till nothing's left, not even phrases. The next room's filled with paintings, hung in even stacks, some layered rich in color, others finely sketched. Soon the pigment slowly fades, oil drips away, revealing stark blank canvases, white walls in decay. Each figure in the next hall holds a perfect pose, muscles carved from blocks of stone, unblinking eyes set deep, left still on polished pedestals, ever on display, until they're melted down by fire into molten pools, becoming solid masses as the steaming swirl cools. I step into the final room where mirrors line each wall. Lit only by a single beam, I'm pulled towards the light, and just like the art before, my body starts to fade, dissolving into shadows that vanish through the floor. And so I join words paint and stone jumbled in the tomb, then waiting for 3 days to pass, I rise once more and bloom. So that's the final poem. The original version of this poem was very different. This is the raw version. One advantage of using Google Docs to start all my poems, I typically write them on my phone because I'm writing in bed in dark mode so I don't drive my spouse nuts. The first version was written on April 28th at 4:52 a.m. And I wrote just a series of images. I had this idea of, I love art galleries in general. I had this idea of going through an art gallery where in each gallery, one of books, one of sculpture, one of art, everything melts into the floor until the person touring the gallery melts into the floor too. So that was sort of the image-rich starting point. But I didn't know what the heck this poem was, and I was really struggling to take it into something that worked. And in between April 28, 2020 and the final version at the end of August, I had versions of this that were heavily rhymed and metered. I had many different iterations. The ending, this resurrection ending, that idea came really late. That's not an idea I had at the beginning, but I needed a way to have this poem be more than just a series of strong images. And that's a challenge I've faced, and I know poets face in many of their work, is you've got this strong set of images that are really interesting, but they're not yet a poem. How do you make that? How do you turn these strong images into a poem? And in the final version, I had this idea of structure where rather than being heavily metered and rhymed, it would start with one line stanza, then two, then three, then four, then five, then six. So as you're getting deeper into the gallery, the stanzas are getting longer, and the visual nature of it, and even the lines for the most part get longer. And then it all worked. It required some tough editing. I had to make the library stanza half the size, and I don't remember what I wrote before, but I remember the time those were really hard edits. But by that point I knew what the poem needed to look like and its form. So you can see that I just started by writing words and then turned it into a poem over many revisions. I get asked about reciting poetry. Well, I've written poetry for decades, but only in the start of this year did I get serious about performing my poetry in public, which is a very hard thing to do. Anyone who goes to the open mic for the first time, it's terrifying. Many poems are about things that are very personal, and as a result, there's a vulnerability. So I actually hired a poetry coach, someone who was really good at reciting poetry, a theater major. And he really helped me approach reciting poetry in a structured way. So these are some of the tips that he gave me. So the first thing is everything is about being intentional. How you're reading the poem, how you mark up the poem for performance. By marking it up, I mean adding punctuation that doesn't appear in the poem. The third point that I thought was really interesting, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, is you as the poet know where the poem's going, but the audience doesn't, presuming that they haven't read it previously. So because they don't know where it's going, there may be a turn, a twist, something that you can set up and then surprise people. And then the fourth thing is, well, how do you manage stage fright? So I'll come back to that in a minute. So to come up with that, to really lean in on that third point and a couple other points I made, I'm going to read a poem from my book canvas. The poem is called Crush. Teen week at Foxwood Inn. I'm 15, scrawny, bookwormed and shy. She arrives so tall, her rich brown curls waving a smile, dazzling and confident. The crush envelops me, its weight taking my breath away. As she turns the corner, there is no time to say hi, and I fear being caught staring too long. Each morning after breakfast, I peek over my paperback, waiting for her to pass by, and if her eyes catch mine, I shrink and blush, my heart crushed and racing. Later by the dock, the jocks show off their running, shirtless, headlong dives while I sit silently on a fading Muskoka chair, tucking my book under a towel, avoiding splashes. When the last night comes, her name a mystery still, with Stairway to Heaven's sorrowful intro begun, I crush fear, walking towards her, extending my hand, offering a dance. She looks me in the eye and quietly nods, no, and takes the dance floor with one of the diving boys. I walk into darkness across dew-damp grass, down to the end of the dock, sitting, legs swinging, toes caressing the still cool lake, Robert Plant echoing in the distance. Between chords, I hear her footsteps. She's there, her hand on my shoulder, a tear sliding down my cheek. I like you, James, but just as a friend, sitting down beside me as the song ends. I feel the crush as my imagined first kiss drifts away with the ripples beneath my feet, but in time smile, eyes closed and dry, replaying her saying my name. So a couple things. In preparing to read that poem, I added punctuation where there isn't any in the actual poem. Punctuation that is almost scene direction, stage direction to me as the reader. That's about being intentional. And then the part of this poem that I really hadn't thought about was I know that she doesn't say yes when I ask her to dance, but the audience doesn't know that. So the coach I was working with said, set it up so it could be more likely that she's going to say yes, and then people are surprised or more impacted when they say no, when she says no. So those are a few simple things that you can use to help prepare to read your poem. In terms of managing stage fright, uh, originally I think I called this slide conquering stage fright, but you never really conquer stage fright. In fact, nervousness is a very powerful tool. My parents, who are both musicians, say the day you're not nervous before a performance is the day you should retire as a performer. But there is an importance to managing stage fright or that nervousness. And certainly preparation is one of them. Slowing down when you start is another way, because once you get going, you get into a flow. There's I think stage fright starts to wither away. So you also have to know that nervousness is really going to be short-lived, and if you can get through the first minute, you're probably past the worst of it. So the night before a big event that I was organizing and going to be reciting poetry out with a bunch of other poets, woke up in the middle of the night thinking of all the details, and I wrote this poem, which I ended up using at the last minute to open that event. Ode to the Spoken Word. I take the mic, fingers gripping, paper quivering. I take the mic and in a moment become each word that weeks before kept me awake after midnight, or calmed my racing mind when sleep was lost, or fell out of me faster than I could type. I take the mic, words, phrases, sounds, rhythm, imagining them come alive to swirl through the audience as if kicked up by a winter storm. I take the mic and sense the shadows leaning in to catch every word, every image painted through these amplified waves on air. And for that event, which I was nervous about, having that poem, which I was excited to read, was very effective. So another way to manage stage fright is to, as a poet, you probably get to affect the order of things. Put the thing you're most excited to share up front, and that excitement may overshadow any nervousness. So title poems for books are important. For my first book, Canvas was the poem that really inspired me to feel ready to publish a book after decades of writing poetry on and off. And it was also a poem that lent itself very nicely to a cover inspiration. So I'll come back to to how the cover came to be, which is a pretty cool story. But I will start by reading the cover poem, Canvas. Canvas. I stretch myself over the frame, pulled taut to smooth skin's creases, my canvas set, awaiting your first stroke. You lay out the brushes with care, bristles clean and dry. The first brush, its head cut sharp to detail the subtle wrinkles around my eyes. The second wide to fill my laughing smile. The third rough to capture a storm swelling behind me over the sea. And one more, a piercing point to drop a tear that belies my melancholy. Stepping back, you scan me before preparing your palette. What shade of Caucasian to choose for my sun-aged skin? How much gray will you need to sneak silver threads into my thick brown hair? How should you dress me? What textures will you drape? Am I alone on a trail or seething in a concert crowd? How will you capture the chaotic cacophony swirling in my mind with only strokes of oil? And how can you reflect everything I've seen into the detail of my eyes? And are they wide open, alert, unable to find sleep, or quivering and fighting exhaustion? Or are they shut tight and twitching in REM-triggered dreams? Or are they still serene like death? I think you should start with my memories. So many to choose from, you can't possibly paint them all, lest the layers grow so deep that the color slides from me dripping forgotten onto the floor. Perhaps start with the bliss of running through a New England park, pulling a kite, its fluttering tail flying up into the crisp fall breeze, the critch, critch sound of leaves beneath my feet. Perhaps start with the melancholy of bully's fear that started in 6th grade and lingered relentless until my scrawny frame sprouted 6 feet tall in high school. Perhaps start with the sound of music from my parents practicing while I lie beneath the Steinway, floating on waves of notes as father's fingers race the keys while mother's oboe pierces the chords. Or perhaps start with the near silence of when I escape the frenetic digital pulse and head onto a trail, stepping in rhythm until hours later I lie back, eyes closed, to let my ears explore the forest depths. I hope you choose to paint me with my eyes wide open so I can see your expression as you apply the final stroke. And when you are done and the paint is drying, its pungent odor slowly fading and imperceptible until the last molecule of scent escapes. And when you walk away, your brush is cleaned and neatly packed, your tubes of paint capped and stored. Will you remember me? Will you remember each brush stroke and shade of oil? Will you be relieved to finish me, to escape this dreary task? Or will you wait until the palette runs dry so we can share this moment a little longer? So that poem, unlike Gallery, which Gallery took many, many revisions and I almost threw in the towel halfway through. This poem, I woke up one morning and it just fell out of me, 80% pretty much there. And I just couldn't write on my phone fast enough to capture it. And then I went back, of course, and did lots of editing and wordsmithing and perfecting. But sometimes a poem falls out of you. It really only happened twice, and this was the second time. So that poem became the inspiration for the title of the book, as well as for the cover art. And cover art is really important. They say the expression is you can't judge a book by its cover, but that's total nonsense because we judge books by their covers all the time. And my personal view is if there's a lot of care put into the cover of the book, that's a good sign. And if the cover wasn't done with care, that's not a very good sign. So covers are really important. So in getting the cover for my book, I was very fortunate to have a good friend who is also an artist. You'll probably recognize her from Mythbusters. She's now the co-founder of a startup, Explore Media. But she's been an artist since she went to university. And one of the techniques of art she uses is black powder art. Rather than describe it, I will show it. So here's a short video that demonstrates this technique of black powder art. That also inspired one of the poems in my book, Canvas, which I'm going to read while the video is playing. And the poem is named Powder Appropriately. Here we go. Powder. Fingertips stained by pistol powder piled, burying brushstrokes. You twist the fuse wires, tucking them snug, awaiting batteries spark. When you ignite the powder, time distorts, a blinding flash of flame and smoke, a metal tube focusing flying detritus from chain reactions fury. When the fire cools, steam drifts away, scorched canvas revealed, you delicately carve the soot-soaked clay, unveiling a tattered flag. Transfixed by blackened brushstrokes, delicate lines and flame, I savor the lingering scent of scorched powder. So as you can see here, Kari is scraping off the clay that was used to protect part of the painting from the black powder explosion. And through years of trial and error, she knows, if you put too much black powder, you don't have a piece of art afterwards. If you put too little, then you don't get this really wonderful effect, this stochastic effect from the black powder. And then when it's all done, you scrape off the clay to reveal the piece, which in this case was meant to reflect a poet at the mic, and the paint splatters being the words flung onto the audience conceptually. So really, really cool. And I have the original, probably hard to see, but over my shoulder in my home office. So the poetry is a natural partner to many things. Another thing it's a natural partner to is film. And I was very fortunate to have a poem from my debut book, Tethered, turned into an animated short film by a wonderful Italian animator, Gaia Alari. And this is a completely hand-drawn animated short, which I'll show in a second. 750 hand-drawn frames, couple of minutes of poetry. That's how much work it is. Animation is a wonderful art form, very meticulous. Gaia was moved by the poem, saw a lot of parallels in the themes to many things. In her case, she interpreted thinking about the shutdowns in Italy during the height of the first wave of the pandemic. So here is Tethered.
I've long ago learned to ignore the rhythmic tug of the chain that tethers me to the ocean floor. A chill curls around my painted stripes as fog rolls toward a distant shore and wave-powered bells warn those sailing near. I hear passing ships cutting towards the Golden Gate and imagine their carefully stacked containers swaying in the swells. Later, fog fades and California's sun steams dew from my metallic frame, unveiling the shore's outline once more. A seagull pauses, perched and chattering, singing me stories until trade winds lift her to dance above whitecaps. Soon, the season of storms returns, bringing fierce waves and wind to power the peals of my warning bells. Deep in winter, mist freezes to my metallic skin, crafting turquoise crystals that flicker in the moonlight. But in time, calm and warmth return, lit by the moon's waning crescent, mirrored on still water's glass. Do I measure time in seasons, or in dawns and dusks, or count the cycles of frost freezing then dripping melted down my spine? Or do I set aside time and count the swells, or passing ships, or pods of dolphins, shivers of sharks, colonies of gulls? I dream of one day being released from my tether, my work complete, transformed into turquoise sea glass, smoothed by tides and resting on a shoreline beach, waiting to catch the eye of a strolling passerby.
So you can see at the end here, that's Gaia flipping through a flip book she made from the 750 frames that comprise this film, or a subset of them. Very, very magical. Poetry can also inspire music. I've had a couple of collaborations and some additional ones planned where poetry of mine has been turned into music. One recent example, my poem Petals in Haiku, a 4-stanza poem, each stanza a haiku. 2 of the stanzas were turned into a short haiku length original piece of music. I will show that in a minute, but first I'll read Petals in Haiku. Petals in Haiku. She lies still, dreaming, petal canopy above on damp, prickly grass. Cherry blossoms fly in full bloom, singing springtime dancing on the breeze. Soon all depart, the tree left bare only to watch her buried below, still, draped in pink, no skin exposed as nightfall draws, petals evanesce. And now I will share the performance of 2 stanzas from that poem by Northern Illinois University School of Music students with the music composed by Yuko Asada. What poems sound like and what a poem looks like can be very different things. In an episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, I had the opportunity to interview Olivia Gatwood, and we talked about one of her poems that has a very distinct visual layout, and I asked her how you read it, and I think that that's an example of a poem, and many poems are like this, that have two versions: the version that you see when you read it, and the version that you hear when you hear it for the first time, and you have to approach them differently. So as an example of that, I'm going to read another poem from my book, Canvas. And I want you to, as I'm reading this, to think about what the poem could possibly look like. Wade, echoes, om, Tibetan singing bowls, resonating hum, by cool water seeping through ancient crevices, building to flow over creek beds lined with time-smoothed pebbles, wading deeper in darkness, leaving an invisible wake, while my fingers follow fractured, barren, blackened shale, consuming all light, the ageless crush, buried stone, haunted depth. Earth slips away, weightless, toes free, legs, torso float soaring above infinity's edge, wading through sunlit dancing water, sparkling in indigo, swaying waist deep, toe tips grip tide-shaped sand, white cap-topped waves, Bahamian sun swirls, arms outstretched, fingers reach, balance, jolted, shoulder taps, nodded off, time for bed, shuffling through nighttime nuisances, one by one, so I can wade back into sleep to search for Bahamian surf or the depths of buried stone. So it'd be interesting to be able to hear what you're thinking, what you saw when you heard that poem. Well, here's what it actually looks like. It's a very Zen-y type poem, so I wanted it to have this kind of symmetry, this almost the thinking of Om and Tibetan singing bowls and the sounds they make, sort of this pattern. And once I settled on that, then I had to make some tricky rewordings, edits, word changes, a little bit of trick there, wading through sunlit, through spelled THRU, and in order to get it to fit. So that's, I think, kind of the fun of poems is puzzles that you unravel. Once I settled on this visualization, I had to make it look this way, but still have it retain the poetry, and I hope that I've accomplished that. Another form of poetry I really love is ekphrastic poetry. First of all, ekphrastic is an awesome poetry word. So from the Poetry Foundation, an ekphrastic poem is a vivid description of a scene, or more commonly a work of art. Through the imaginative act of narrating and reflecting on the action of a painting or sculpture, the poet may amplify and expand its meaning. So I think this is a very useful tool in schools where you can help students get started by taking an image that is powerful and have students interpret it in whatever way it affects them. And you'll likely end up with very different poems. And ekphrastic poems, going back to one of my first points, is the first thing I do is I just sort of describe it in a poetic way and then figure out how to turn it into a poem. So here's an example of that. So this photo of a piece of sculpture that was in progress, not yet complete, by the cover artist, Kari Byron, a very striking sculpture, very powerful. And I used that as a starting point, but I'll show you where I took it. This is also from my book, Canvas. The poem is Carved. Carved. 1. The sculptor prepares her tools. A discarded dentist probe for subtle detail, a twisted rake and wire brush to drape skin. Stepping back, she searches inside the polymer clay block for figures hidden, awaiting release. She starts by sculpting with her fingers, digging, smoothing, molding the clay until features emerge. One tool, then another, shaping, carving, blending, occasionally placing slabs of clay to form curled hair or add a flowing skirt. The sculptor's world collapses inward, city cacophony muted, just fingers, tools, clay working, until in time there is nothing left to carve. 2. The poet prepares his tools, a blank page for letters, syllables, words, phrases, a puzzle to untangle, finding order and place. Stepping back, he stares at the empty page, searching memories for images to transform into well-ordered lines. He starts with random words, pleasing sounds, rhymes, and throwaway couplets to be worked and reworked. Words become phrases, become stanzas, whispered aloud to test their resonance, set aside to revisit later, discarded when impossible to mold. The poet searches for perfection, pacing the floor perplexed until with a final pen stroke, the poem appears. 3. The sculptor's work set on a shelf, the poet's page slipped in a book, visions carved in clay and words buried deep, unseen, unheard. So that the earliest raw cuts of this were really describing this specific piece of art. And then I decided to focus in on the technique of sculpting. Other than in grade school, I've never sculpted anything. So I watched a bunch of videos watching highly talented and skilled sculptors sculpt things. I read articles trying to get the language right. And that's something that poets do that I don't think people realize is we do a lot of research to use the right words, and not just the right words, but the right words that are poetic, and then put the puzzle together. And then I saw, once I really started to learn more about the techniques that sculptors use, I thought of writing poetry as very much an activity like sculpting. And then I had the idea, at least for the first 2 sections, to which are the same length and the same structure, to compare writing poetry with sculpture. And then I had to wrap it up, which took a long time to do, a 4-line last stanza. And then I decided it's more about, they've created these things, and in many cases they're not seen. The words aren't read, and that's how I wrapped it up. So ekphrastic poems are something I really love. I've written several in collaboration with artists, and for students and for teachers that are watching this is a great way to kickstart students and let them take it in any direction that they're moved. A friend of mine who writes poetry, has also published a chapbook, gave me some feedback on the titles of my poetry. And she said, I really have to think about poem titles more as headlines, that when you read the title of the poem, you want to read the whole poem. It seems obvious, but it hadn't really connected the dots. And so recently I've been retitling many of my poems to make them work better as headlines, so that when you read the title of the poem, you want to keep reading it. Now, a good way to test this is to just grab a friend and say, here's the title of my poem, and see if it catches their interest. And if it doesn't, then you probably got to work on the title of the poem. And it also probably makes it easier for your poem to get placed, because it's the very first thing that's going to be read, and it's the thing that may attract the interest of the person who's reading the submissions. If they're caught by the title, then they're going to want to read the whole thing. So a great example of that is a poem that was a lot of fun to write, based on a real experience I had in middle school. And the original title of this poem was Stage Fright, which is fine. That's related to the theme of the poem. But I think this title tested a lot better. That time I was left for dead downstage. 8th grade, my big break. The play was something Western. I had a single line and every actor's dream, a dramatic death. I had to learn how to act with a beard glued on in pieces, the fake hair tickling the bottom of my nose. I wore it home for a day to get used to the feel, My family swallowed giggles during dinner. Opening night approached. My heart raced, imagining the curtain opening on 100 seated shadows. That single line I kept forgetting. Whispers from the director. Time ran out. Hurried discussions. It was decided. My debut line was cut. With a full beard glued on in pieces, tickling the bottom of my nose, a long black coat and top hat, boots one size too big. I walked into the spotlight, said nothing, was shot and left dead at the edge of the stage. I remember lying there, unable to move, eyes closed, silently mouthing my line over and over and over, sensing classmates' footsteps abiling my corpse. So that poem had a very different title that was functional and fine, but this title, from testing it with friends and my poetry critique group, drew people in. So think of poetry titles as headlines, a simple thing, but a hard thing. Finally, nearing the end here, almost finally, if you sense that writer's block is coming on, because usually writer's block doesn't hit you, you smell it coming. A great way to manage writer's block is to change locations. And a good example of that is for this poem, second to last poem I'm going to read, Ghosts of Bodie, California. I wrote this poem when I sensed writer's block coming on, and I invested in changing locations. I drove 6 hours each way to this incredible ghost town in Bodie, California, confident that it would, which I'd never been to before, confident it would inspire me, and it did. Ghosts of Bodie, California. I drove for hours to the Ghosts of Bodie, through Sonora Pass by switchbacks where the air starts to thin, to an abandoned place I know you'd love if I could wake and bring you there. Sierra's wind lifted dust from gravel down a winding dead-end road, spitting rocks left in my wake, a chattering ride through grazing cattle past a graveyard marked with stone. They floated beside me on unpaved streets among rusted carcasses of mining gear, a deluxe Ford stripped, half sunk, the church, town bank, morgue, and outhouses scattered there and here. I peered through the grimy glass, wallpaper stained and draped in shreds, lit by sun through ceiling cracks. A single chair, still and waiting. One miner's lamp ever on display. Scattered trinkets rest suspended. Gold brought them here, 10,000 strong, rushing deep to chase rich veins while stamp mills crushed extracted ore, rising spent when whistles blew, blackened worn, then to their homes. And as happens, time decays. One by one, the settlers fled until the last home's lights went dim, just shadows left to roam and mourn. That's an example of sensing writer's block. Change locations, and you will very likely find new things to write about. I'm going to read this last poem because it's just perfect for the last poem to read for an event like this. Writing my last verse. Will my last verse be copy edited perfect? No more rewrites remaining, submitted and awaiting publication? Or will my last verse be slight, a whispered idea, snuffed silent with my last labored breath? Or will I be wrestling with words, fighting for one more hour to complete a couplet's rhyme? Or will I write my last verse well in advance, tuck it away in a curio box by my bed, so if I fail to wake, nothing's left to chance? Well, hopefully I have many more verses ahead of me, but that's not totally under my control. I want to thank you for spending a few minutes listening to my poetry and things I've learned in writing poetry. If you want to read more of my poetry, you like what you heard, well, Canvas is on sale through my website, viewlesswings.com. There's a short URL, easy to type, tinyurl.com canvas poems, or go to viewlesswings.com. Or you can find it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble websites and in select local and independent booksellers. Thank you very much. My name is James Morehead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California.